The Strait of Hormuz carried 21% of the world's oil yesterday. This morning, it is at a standstill. 3 American warships are repositioning. 1 Iranian frigate is confirmed destroyed. And in Beijing, a phone call happened that nobody in Washington was prepared for. China called Tehran. Not to condemn, not to warn, to coordinate. What you are watching is not a regional conflict that got messy. What you are watching is a superpower chess match, and the United States just lost a piece it did not know was on the board. Trump didn't just order strikes on Iranian military infrastructure. Trump didn't just risk the most volatile waterway on Earth. Trump handed China a gift it has been waiting 15 years to unwrap. He planned for Iran to fold. He planned for regional capitulation within days. He planned for the kind of quick, televised dominance that plays at a rally. He got defiance. He got oil markets spiking 11% in a single session. He got China moving in ways that would have required years of diplomacy to achieve on their own. And in the gap between what he planned for and what actually happened, the entire architecture of American influence in the Middle East is being renegotiated, without us at the table. China is not panicking about this conflict. China is studying it like a blueprint. In the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly how we got here. I am going to walk you through 3 confirmed diplomatic and economic moves China has made in the 48 hours since the first strikes. I am going to explain why those 3 moves, taken together, represent something verifiably more alarming than the military conflict itself. And I am going to tell you why the world you are living in today is measurably more dangerous, not just for the Middle East, but for your energy bill, your retirement account, and the manufacturing economy that employs millions of Americans, than the one you woke up in 2 weeks ago. Imagine you have a business partner. You have done business together for 30 years. Your supply chains are intertwined. You share the same waterways, the same pricing agreements, the same basic assumption that neither of you would blow up the system you both depend on. Now imagine that partner decides to light the warehouse on fire. Not because the warehouse was a problem, but because he wanted to look strong in front of the cameras. And imagine your largest competitor shows up with a fire extinguisher. Not to save the warehouse, to negotiate who rebuilds it. Hold that thought, because that is exactly what China just did in the Gulf. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Is China exploiting a crisis America created? Or is China accelerating a shift that was already inevitable? I want to know where you stand. Let us rewind the clock, because this didn't start with the first airstrike. It started in the spring of 2018, when the United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, and reimposed maximum pressure sanctions. At the time, the architects of that policy made one argument above all others. Economic pain would produce political capitulation. Squeeze Iran hard enough, and the regime would either collapse or come to the table on American terms. That argument rested on one catastrophic assumption: that Iran had no alternative to Western-controlled financial systems, no buyer large enough to absorb its oil, and no partner willing to absorb the diplomatic cost of defying Washington. That assumption died in Beijing, because while Washington was building the pressure campaign, China was quietly doing something else. China was buying. Between 2020 and 2024, China absorbed somewhere between 600,000 and 900,000 barrels of Iranian oil per day. Oil that was sanctioned, discounted, and delivered through a shadow shipping network that American intelligence has tracked but never fully stopped. China never asked Washington's permission. China never apologized. China simply calculated that the long-term strategic benefit of keeping Iran economically viable outweighed any short-term diplomatic friction with the United States. They were right. And now, with American bombers over Persian airspace, that calculation is paying its highest dividend yet. Receipt number 1. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization Emergency Session. According to reporting confirmed by Reuters and the South China Morning Post, China convened an emergency session of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization within 36 hours of the first American strikes. The SCO, for those unfamiliar, is a Eurasian political, economic, and security alliance that includes China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Iran, and 5 Central Asian states. Representing roughly 40% of the world's population and 30% of global GDP. Now stop right there. Iran joined the SCO as a full member in 2023. That was not an accident. That was Iran buying insurance. And for the first time in the organization's history, an emergency meeting was convened specifically in response to American military action against a member state. The communiqué issued from that meeting did not call for de-escalation. It called for, and I want to be precise about the language here, the protection of member state sovereignty against unilateral external military force. That is not diplomatic boilerplate. That is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization saying, out loud, in a formal document, American military action against Iran is a violation of the rules this bloc will defend. No multilateral body of that size has ever issued language like that directed at the United States. Until now. The punchline is short, and it is devastating. America just gave China the legal framework for a counter-alliance, and China didn't even have to write it. Receipt number 2. The oil pricing signal. Here is the part that should make your blood boil. The day the first strikes were confirmed, the White House press secretary stood at the podium and told Americans, on camera, on record, that energy markets were stable, that strategic reserves were sufficient, and that any short-term price disruption would be, quote, transitory. That same morning, Brent crude jumped 11.4% in a single trading session. That is not a blip. That is the largest single-session crude spike since the first week of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Within 24 hours, gas futures were signaling prices at the pump that analysts hadn't modeled for another 2 years under a baseline scenario. That is not fog of war. That is not a communications error. That is the administration telling you one thing while markets confirmed another. And the gap between those two things is already showing up in the numbers every American household tracks. But here is what didn't get reported above the fold. China called an emergency session of its National Development and Reform Commission, its top economic planning body, and within 48 hours, China had negotiated an emergency oil supply agreement with Saudi Arabia. Not to replace Iranian oil. China was already getting Iranian oil, to lock in Saudi pricing in yuan, not dollars, yuan. The petrodollar system, the arrangement that has anchored American financial dominance since 1974, depends on one thing above all others, that oil is priced and settled in US dollars. Every time a major producer agrees to price in another currency, that foundation chips. This week, it chipped again. And the American public was told prices were transitory. That is not a miscommunication. That is a trust issue. If this is the first place you've seen these 3 receipts assembled in one place, that is exactly why this channel exists. There are major developments in this story still to come in this video, including what China's military just moved into position in the South China Sea, and why that movement has nothing to do with Taiwan. Hit subscribe right now. This story is accelerating faster than any single mainstream outlet is tracking, and you need to be here when the next piece drops. Now compare the strategic architecture Beijing is constructing to what the administration is actually saying publicly. The president told Truth Social, and this is a direct quote, "The United States has never been more respected. Our strength is obvious to everyone. Watch what happens next." Watch what happens next. 3 American service members are confirmed injured in retaliatory drone strikes on a base in Iraq. The Strait of Hormuz is operating at reduced capacity. China is coordinating with Iran, Russia, and Saudi Arabia simultaneously. European allies have not endorsed the military action, and the president's analysis is that our strength is obvious to everyone. Watch what happens next. A senior administration spokesperson was then asked, directly, by a reporter, "Has the administration modeled the economic consequences of a prolonged Hormuz disruption on American consumers?" The response was, "We don't negotiate with hypotheticals. These are not serious people managing a serious crisis. These are performers staging confidence while the waterway that carries a fifth of the world's energy supply is being used as a geopolitical weapon against us in real time." Here is the part that should keep American strategists awake at night. China's response to this conflict has not been military. It has been architectural, and that is far more dangerous. In the 48 hours following the strikes, 3 things happened that you need to understand as a connected sequence, not 3 separate stories. First, China accelerated the yuan oil settlement agreement with the Saudis, a move that takes a chip out of petrodollar dominance. Second, China's COSCO Shipping, one of the largest maritime fleets on Earth, quietly rerouted 17 of its vessels away from lanes that American naval assets are currently patrolling, signaling that China is not going to have its shipping assets caught in a shooting gallery. Third, and this is the one that should alarm every serious analyst, the People's Liberation Army Navy moved 2 additional vessels into the Persian Gulf region, not positioned for combat, but positioned for observation, for presence, for the message that China belongs at this table, whether Washington invited them or not. China's entire response to this crisis follows one playbook. Do not escalate militarily. Advance structurally. Let the Americans burn the furniture while you redesign the room. That strategy did not start this week. It has been running for a decade. But every time Washington creates a crisis it cannot quickly resolve, China accelerates the timeline. The Iran conflict is not a distraction from the China competition. The Iran conflict is the China competition, playing out in real time in a theater where America chose to fight and China chose to architect. The administration's action did not contain the threat. It expanded it, exactly as the Pentagon's own wargaming analysts warned it would. One image from this week captures the entire story. On one side, the president at a rally in front of a crowd, fists raised, telling supporters that America is winning, that the enemy is broken, that nobody can believe the strength on display. On the other side, a Chinese diplomat in a suit, in a quiet room in Riyadh, signing a document that moves another $1 billion of oil settlement out of the dollar system and into yuan. One side is noise, the other is architecture. One side is performing, the other is building. One side is looking at the crowd, the other is looking at the decade. Gut instinct versus risk assessment. A gambler versus a strategist. Heat versus ice. The rally versus the podium. The grievance versus the bypass. The 19th century tool of force versus the 21st century tool of financial infrastructure. This is not a close contest. And the scorecard does not care who has the louder microphone. China did not have to fire a single shot this week to advance its position by years. It just had to show up with a pen, while Washington showed up with bombs. So what does this actually mean for you? Not for diplomats, not for analysts in Washington think tanks, for the person watching this, trying to figure out whether any of this lands on their doorstep. If you work in the energy sector, oil, gas, refining, pipeline, the Hormuz disruption is already being modeled by your industry. Every barrel that cannot transit that waterway gets repriced on global markets within hours. That repricing flows downstream through every product that moves on a truck, a ship, or a plane. The energy industry is not immune to this disruption. It is the first domino. If you hold a 401k or any equity exposure, look at the VIX, the volatility index, this week. It's spiked sharply. That is not a blip. That is institutional money pricing in a scenario where this conflict extends beyond 30 days. A sustained Hormuz disruption of 60 days or more has been modeled by J.P. Morgan, Goldman, and the Federal Reserve's own stress testing division. Every model produces the same outcome, a significant recessionary input on the American economy. Not a maybe, a mechanism. Your retirement account is not insulated from this by geography. If you drive a car, which is most Americans watching this, the pump price signal is already moving. What the administration called transitory is being priced by futures markets as structural. The average American household spends somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 a year on gasoline. An 11% spike in crude, sustained for 60 days, does not stay in crude. It flows to every product with a fuel cost embedded in its supply chain, which is nearly everything you buy. If you work in manufacturing, auto assembly, aerospace components, agricultural equipment, your supply chains run through global shipping lanes that are now being rerouted. Rerouting costs money. Rerouting adds time. Manufacturers who have already been squeezed by tariff uncertainty are now being squeezed by route uncertainty. The calculation for whether to restructure production, whether to move facilities, source differently, reassess, gets made faster when two risks stack on top of each other. Those decisions, once made, are not reversed when the crisis ends. And if you are a military family, if someone you love is deployed or could be deployed, Congress was never asked to authorize this action. There was no vote. There was no debate. The constitutional process that exists precisely for moments like this was bypassed. What happens next is now being decided by a small group of people who planned for 4 days and are now managing week 3. The administration is on television saying the operation is a success. The operation is unfinished. The region is more volatile. China is more empowered. And the structural consequences of this week are already compounding in markets, alliances, and supply chains that do not pause while the press secretary finds her talking points. Here is the hard truth. Iran did not want this confrontation in the form it took. China did not manufacture this crisis. The Persian Gulf did not ask to become the arena where American strategic credibility gets tested. But Trump's miscalculation, his absolute conviction that maximum military force produces immediate submission, left every actor in this region no choice but to respond to the reality of American bombs, not the theory of American strength. China is not responding emotionally. China is not doing this out of ideological opposition to the United States. China is doing it because the math demands it. Because every month of American strategic overextension is a month China can consolidate the alternative architecture it has been building since 2013. This conflict did not start because Iran was an unmanageable threat. It started because someone needed a victory that would play in a campaign cycle. And the people now managing the consequences of that decision are the ones who had nothing to do with making it. Where does this go from here? I see 3 paths. The first is what I will call the managed descent. In this scenario, back-channel negotiations, likely mediated through Oman, which has historically served as the quiet diplomatic bridge between Washington and Tehran, produce a temporary cessation. Iran agrees to limited concessions on nuclear positioning. The United States agrees to limited sanctions relief. The strikes are framed as a success. The rally plays the clip. And by most public measures, this looks like a resolution. But even in this best case, the damage is not undone. The yuan oil settlement agreements China signed this week do not expire with a ceasefire. The SCO communique framing American military action as a violation of member sovereignty does not get unwritten. The Costco shipping reroutes become new habits. The petrodollar chip does not get glued back. Even if Trump walks this back tomorrow, the structural architecture China built this week does not get dismantled. It becomes the new baseline. The managed descent is the best case. It is still permanently costly. The second path is what I will call the domino alignment. This is the scenario that nobody in the mainstream is naming clearly, and it should genuinely terrify serious strategists. In this scenario, the conflict extends beyond 60 days. Iran activates its full proxy network, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, not for a decisive military confrontation, but for sustained friction. The Hormuz disruption becomes chronic rather than acute. And the countries watching this, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Turkey, India, begin making permanent adjustments to their strategic positioning. Not away from America in a dramatic declaration, quietly, through energy agreements in yuan, through SCO membership, through weapons procurement that doesn't require American approval. Every country with a choice to make is watching this crisis as a proof of concept. And once the new routes are built, once the new agreements are signed, once the new architecture exists, it does not restructure back because Washington signs a communique. The third path is the one nobody wants to say out loud. In this scenario, a miscalculation, not a decision, a miscalculation, produces direct military engagement between American and Iranian forces at a scale that triggers the alliance clauses nobody has read carefully. Russia has defense agreements with Iran. China has defense agreements with Russia. The SCO communique issued this week is not just rhetoric, it is a legal framework. Under escalating military pressure, someone on one side does something that crosses a threshold that the other side cannot publicly absorb. You would normally say no rational actor goes there. No president, no general, no diplomat chooses that outcome. But normal left the building a long time ago. The advisors who would pump the brakes have been removed, replaced, or sidelined. The congressional authorization process was bypassed. The intelligence community's warnings were overridden by gut instinct, and there are no more guardrails. Here is what I know for certain. Regardless of which of those 3 paths plays out, regardless of whether there is a ceasefire next week or an escalation next month, several things have already permanently changed. The Yuan oil settlement infrastructure that China accelerated this week is now real. It will not be reversed. Every producer who signs on makes the next signature easier and the system more legitimate. Even if the Iran conflict ends cleanly, the mechanism China built in the crisis does not go away. The SCO's formal language of collective defense against American military action is now in a communiqué. It is in the record. The next time Washington considers unilateral military action against any SCO member, that record exists. It will be cited. It will be invoked. The alliance relationships with Europe, with the Gulf states, with Asia, that depend on American predictability are now recalibrating. They are not announcing it loudly. They are doing it quietly, in the way serious countries do when they update their risk models. China didn't start this fight. China didn't need to. China needed America to start it for them. And China is proving to be extraordinarily patient at waiting for that moment. Not because China is aggressive, because China is operating on a time horizon its opponent cannot comprehend. Because China looks at this not as a crisis to manage, but as a decade to build. Trump is looking at the next rally. Beijing is looking at the next 20 years. Right now, the next 20 years are being built everywhere except Washington. Before you go, 2 questions, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Did Iran walk into a trap of its own making, or did Washington hand Beijing an opportunity that Iran simply survived long enough to benefit from? And when the economic consequences of this week reach your town, when they show up in your gas bill, your grocery receipt, your retirement statement, will the people who cheered loudest for this still say it was worth it? Drop your answer below. I read every single one. Subscribe because the next development in this story, China's positioning in the South China Sea in the next 14 days, is going to change the frame entirely. This story is not slowing down. Do not look away.